Imagine standing on the deck of a steel landing craft in the pitch-black hours before dawn, the English Channel churning beneath you, thousands of engines groaning in the darkness around you, and knowing that in a few hours you will either make history or become part of a casualty list. That was the reality for more than 150,000 young men on the 6th of June, 1944. This is the story of D-Day, told through the same grainy, hand-cranked footage that combat cameramen risked their lives to capture, now restored and brought back to life in color. By the spring of 1944, the outcome of the Second World War hinged on a single, staggering gamble. Nazi Germany had occupied France for 4 years, fortifying the coastline with concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, and minefields under what the Germans called the Atlantic Wall. The Allies knew that if they were ever going to liberate Western Europe, they would have to smash through that wall in one of the most dangerous amphibious assaults ever attempted. Planning for the invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, had been underway for more than a year, involving American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces coordinating across land, sea, and air on a scale the world had never seen. Long before a single soldier set foot on a Normandy beach, the invasion began quietly, thousands of miles away, on the shores of the United States. In places like Chesapeake Bay, young sailors and soldiers who had never seen combat trained relentlessly, practicing the delicate and dangerous choreography of getting men from ship to shore. They rehearsed loading and unloading flat-bottomed landing craft, timing their runs to the beach, and learning to work as a single unit under pressure. For many of these men, this was their first time away from home, and the drills in friendly American waters were their only preparation for what awaited them an ocean away. As winter turned to spring, convoy after convoy set out across the Atlantic, carrying troops, tanks, trucks, and supplies toward staging areas in Great Britain. Life aboard these transport ships fell into a strange rhythm of boredom and anticipation. Soldiers played cards, wrote letters home, and tried not to think too much about what lay ahead. The crossing itself was uneventful for most, but the psychological weight of knowing they were sailing toward the greatest battle of their lives never fully lifted. Once in England, the training intensified. Along the southern coast, Navy and Coast Guard crews ran landing exercises day and night, rehearsing beach assaults against a coastline that, for now, was still friendly. Larger vessels, including tank landing ships and infantry landing craft, practiced hitting precise locations at precise times, because on the actual day of invasion, timing would mean the difference between life and death. Overhead, Allied bombers flew constant sorties over occupied France, striking German communication lines, coastal defenses, and transportation networks in an effort to cripple the enemy's ability to reinforce the beaches once the invasion began. Southern England itself became a staging ground unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Thousands of vessels representing every branch of the Allied navies gathered along the coast, their crews making final checks on engines, weapons, and equipment. When ration packs began arriving aboard the ships, soldiers understood without being told that the invasion was close. In the final days before departure, troops boarded smaller landing craft that ferried them out to the larger transport ships waiting offshore, a slow and repetitive process that stretched over hours as tens of thousands of men found their place in the invasion fleet. By the 5th of June, many units had already been sealed aboard their vessels, cut off from communication with the outside world to protect the secrecy of the operation. For these men, the waiting became its own kind of ordeal. There was little left to do but check their gear one final time, write what might be a last letter home, and try to rest before the operation none of them could turn back from. Meanwhile, the Allied air campaign reached a new intensity, with bombing raids over the French coast becoming near constant as commanders tried to soften German defenses in the final hours before the landing. At ports across southern England, commanding officers gathered their men for final briefings, laying out routes, objectives, and expected resistance as clearly as intelligence allowed. Then, in the pre-dawn hours, the great fleet began moving out of coastal waters and into the open channel. Slow-moving tank landing ships loaded with heavy equipment fell into formation alongside troop transports, while fast destroyers and cruisers moved to screen the convoy from any German naval or air attack. What followed was one of the most extraordinary sights any of these men would ever witness. A fleet stretching from one horizon to the other, made up of warships, transports, landing craft, and support vessels representing the combined industrial and military might of the Allied nations. As dawn approached on June the 6th, the ships reached their assigned positions off the coast of Normandy. Below deck, officers pored over maps marking the invasion beaches, 5 stretches of coastline codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each assigned to different Allied forces. Overhead, the skies belonged entirely to Allied aircraft, a stark contrast to years of German air superiority over occupied Europe. For the men aboard the landing craft, this was the moment the training, the waiting, and the anxiety of the past months finally converged into action. The first landing craft to approach the beaches encountered a nightmare of underwater and shoreline obstacles, steel and concrete structures placed by German forces specifically to tear open the hulls of approaching vessels or detonate mines against them. Larger landing craft moved in more slowly, navigating around these obstacles as best they could while machine gun and artillery fire raked the shoreline from German positions dug into the bluffs above. On some sections of beach, resistance was fierce and immediate. On others, the initial landings met comparatively lighter opposition. Troops waded ashore under fire, many of them soaked, exhausted, and terrified, but they kept moving forward because there was no other option. Once the first wave secured a foothold, the operation shifted into its next phase. Landing craft. Once the first wave secured a foothold, the operation shifted into its next phase. Landing craft returned to the transport ships offshore to ferry additional troops in, while larger vessels waited beyond the range of German guns until beach conditions allowed them to move closer. Heavy equipment, including tanks and artillery, had to be transferred onto specialized flat-bottomed barges capable of pushing all the way onto the sand. Thousands of reinforcements poured ashore in the hours and days that followed, gradually shifting the balance of the fight in the Allies' favor. The human cost of those first hours and days was immense. Wounded soldiers were carried back to the beaches to be evacuated to hospital ships waiting offshore, while rescue boats searched the churning water for survivors from damaged or destroyed landing craft. Some vessels, crippled by mines or gunfire, could not make it all the way to shore and had to be abandoned, their crews and passengers pulled from the water under continued fire. Captured German soldiers, dazed and disarmed, were gathered on the beaches to await transport, some of the first tangible evidence that the invasion was succeeding. Within days, the beachhead was firmly in Allied hands, though the evidence of the fierce fighting remained everywhere along the shore. Wrecked vehicles, damaged landing craft, and the debris of battle scattered across the sand. Engineers worked to clear obstacles and repair damaged equipment, much of which would be seaworthy again within days. Even as the front line pushed inland, the beaches themselves remained a hub of activity, with a constant stream of tank landing ships unloading cargo and troops moving forward to reinforce the advance. At night, German aircraft occasionally slipped through to harass the beachhead and lay mines offshore, a reminder that the danger had not fully passed even after the initial assault succeeded. To keep the flow of supplies moving without a captured deep water port, Allied engineers built artificial harbors out of deliberately sunken ships and prefabricated concrete structures, an extraordinary feat of military engineering. This makeshift infrastructure had to handle the enormous volume of Allied shipping required to sustain the growing invasion force. Just weeks after the landings, a severe channel storm battered the coastline, damaging ships and slowing the flow of supplies at a critical moment, an unwelcome reminder that the sea itself remained an unpredictable adversary. As the front pushed inland, the fighting shifted from the beaches to the French countryside and its shattered towns. Cities like Cherbourg, a vital deep-water port, became key objectives, though retreating German forces deliberately destroyed harbor facilities and bridges to deny their use to the advancing Allies, delaying full operational use of the port for weeks. Thousands of German prisoners were taken in the fighting for Normandy's towns, marched to holding areas before being shipped back to England and eventually to prisoner-of-war camps. Combat correspondents and photographers moved with the troops throughout this campaign, documenting the war as it unfolded. Many of these journalists, representing major American and international news organizations, shared the same risks as the soldiers they covered, and several lost their lives in the course of the campaign. Their first-hand accounts and photographs became some of the most important historical records of the invasion, offering perspectives that official military reports could not capture. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France through the summer of 1944, they encountered coastal fortifications built using forced labor, massive concrete structures designed to repel any seaborne assault, now standing silent and often deliberately destroyed by retreating German engineers to prevent their reuse. The advance continued toward key objectives further inland, supported by forward airstrips hastily constructed near the front lines, allowing fighter aircraft to provide close air support to ground troops pushing toward the German-held city of Saint-Lô and beyond. By late August, Allied forces stood at the gates of Paris. In a decision made for both strategic and symbolic reasons, overall Commander General Dwight Eisenhower granted the honor of liberating the French capital to the Free French 2nd Armored Division, ensuring that French forces would be the first to enter their own capital. When Parisians realized their city was finally being liberated after 4 years of German occupation, the celebration that followed was overwhelming. Crowds filled the streets, and General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French forces, led a triumphant march down the Champs-Élysées, an image that remains one of the defining moments of the liberation of Western Europe. The celebration, however, was interrupted by sporadic gunfire from holdout collaborators and remaining German snipers positioned throughout the city, sending crowds scrambling for cover in the middle of what should have been an unambiguous moment of joy. The fighting was sporadic and largely contained within hours, but it served as a sobering reminder that the war was far from over, even as Paris rejoiced in its newfound freedom. From Paris, the Allied advance continued eastward, through the French countryside and into Belgium, and eventually toward the German border itself. Along the way, Allied troops encountered the Siegfried Line, a network of German fortifications and anti-tank obstacles that stretched along the western border of Germany. Despite the imposing appearance of these defenses, Allied engineers found ways to overcome many of the obstacles relatively quickly, continuing the advance into German territory itself, where the reception from the local population stood in stark contrast to the celebrations in liberated France. As the campaign moved into the autumn and winter of 1944, fighting continued in cities along the German frontier, including the historic city of Aachen, the first major German city to fall to Allied forces. The battle for these border regions proved costly and difficult, foreshadowing the intense fighting that would follow throughout the winter, including the brutal battles that would soon erupt further south in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Looking back at this footage today, restored and rendered in color for modern audiences, what stands out is not just the scale of the operation, but the humanity captured within it. The exhaustion on the faces of young men who had spent days aboard cramped landing craft, the relief and joy of Parisians celebrating their freedom, and the quiet, grim resolve of soldiers who understood the stakes of what they were doing. The combat photographers who captured these images did so at enormous personal risk, often working just steps behind the front line, driven by the belief that future generations deserved an honest visual record of what actually happened on those beaches and in those towns. The invasion of Normandy remains one of the most meticulously documented military operations in history, and the survival of this original footage, shot on 16mm film under combat conditions, is itself something of a small miracle. Restoration technology has allowed historians and filmmakers to bring color and clarity back to images that had faded and degraded over the decades, giving modern viewers a far more visceral connection to events that might otherwise feel distant and abstract. What emerges is not a sanitized version of history, but a more immediate and human one, populated not by faceless armies, but by individual young men and women thrust into circumstances almost impossible to fully comprehend from the comfort of the present day. It's worth remembering just how much uncertainty surrounded the entire operation, even for the men making the final decisions. Weather forecasts in the days leading up to June 6th were unreliable enough that the invasion was postponed by a full day, and commanders had to weigh a narrow window of acceptable tides, moonlight, and sea conditions against the risk of the entire operation being discovered by German intelligence. A single miscalculation could have meant catastrophe on a scale difficult to imagine, sending tens of thousands of men into an assault under conditions that offered no real chance of success. That the invasion proceeded when it did, and succeeded as thoroughly as it did, was the product of exhaustive planning combined with no small amount of fortune. The logistics behind Operation Overlord alone represented one of the most complex undertakings of the entire war. Beyond the ships and soldiers, the operation required an almost unimaginable volume of fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and spare parts, all of which had to be produced, transported, and delivered on a precise schedule across an active war zone. Entire industries on both sides of the Atlantic had spent months, if not years, gearing up specifically to support this single operation. The artificial harbors built off the Normandy coast, along with a system of underwater fuel pipelines later laid across the Channel floor, reflected an engineering ambition that matched the military scale of the invasion itself. For the men who survived the initial landings, the following weeks brought a different kind of hardship. The bocage countryside of Normandy, crisscrossed with dense hedgerows that had grown for centuries, turned out to be brutally difficult terrain for offensive operations, giving German defenders countless opportunities to dig in and slow the Allied advance. Progress that had seemed rapid on the beaches slowed to a grinding, costly campaign of village-by-village fighting through the summer, a phase of the invasion that rarely receives the same attention as the landings themselves, but claimed a heavy toll in casualties on both sides. More than 80 years later, the beaches of Normandy remain a place of pilgrimage and remembrance, their sands and the cliffs above them still bearing physical traces of that day in June 1944. Cemeteries overlooking the coastline hold the graves of thousands of soldiers who never made it home, a permanent reminder of the cost paid to turn the tide of the war in Europe. The operation that began in the darkness of a channel crossing and ended with the liberation of a continent stands as one of the defining chapters of the 20th century, a testament to both the horror of large-scale warfare and the extraordinary courage of the individuals who lived through it. As this restored footage shows, history is not an abstraction confined to textbooks. It is made up of real people, real fear, real courage, and moments that changed the course of the modern world forever.